The Inventive Hugs of Elgin, Oregon. Introduction, as told by Bernal Hug in his book, History of Elgin, Oregon. The most fascinating stories are true ones, and the best true stories are those about people and places close to us. History is a true story. It gives us a better understanding of people and places. This better understanding creates better citizenship. When you have finished reading the history of Elgin, Oregon, please ponder the following questions according to Bernal. Why do we not insist on calling the bridge at the historic crossing of the river east of Elgin the Fish Trap Bridge, and the hill beyond the Fish Trap Hill? Could we someday have a fireproof place to place articles of the past that are fast slipping away? A local museum? We have an Indian Valley Lodge. Who will be the first to use the old names of Hanaha or Lauchau as places of business? Reflections of Bernal Hug. Bernal D. Hug Sr. was a farmer, an author, a recorder of stories, the family historian, a religious man who was a founder of the Christian Church of Elgin. He was an educated person, graduating from Oregon State. He was a visionary, bringing the first tractor to the area, giving up the horses. What shaped this ambitious, interesting man? Who are his family? For the Elgin Hugs, the beginning of the story starts in Switzerland. The paternal grandfather of all the Hugs in Elgin was John Jacob Hug. John Jacob was a recorder for the city government, just like his father. He had a comfortable home and some land for his vineyard, where his ancestors lived, died, and were buried. He married Regula Stalzer, who was 8 years younger than him, and they had 6 living children. The town Weinigen, near Zurich, where John Jacob's family lived, probably doesn't look much different than it did when Jacob lived there 200 years ago. Today, Weinigen has an area where about a third of the land is used for agriculture or forestry, a third for buildings and roads, and another third are the mountain peaks, valleys, and hills. Very similar to Elgin, nestled between the Blues and Willawas. In 1850, the community population was 832 people. Of those 832 people were John Jacob, his wife Regula, and their 6 children, 1 daughter and 5 sons. In 1850, the children ranged in age from 14 years to 26 years, and the older ones had started to marry and raise families of their own. But a major disruption was about to happen. In America, a man named Joseph Smith founded the Mormon Church in 1830, since called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The first missionary to reach Switzerland was Thomas Brown Holmes Stenhouse. He arrived that year of 1850 and was very successful at converting John Jacob's wife and children to the new religion. So taken with it was Henry, the son, that he became a missionary. 4 years later, in 1854, Regula, the mother, and all the children, with the exception of Henry, left Switzerland for the New Zion. Regula asked her husband, John Jacob, to go with them, but John Jacob said he didn't believe in the new religion, and he couldn't leave the family home that had been in the family for generations. 5 years later, in 1859, Henry, who had spent those years traveling around Europe as a missionary, also left for America. The sad day approached, and the last of John Jacob's children left for Salt Lake City, leaving John Jacob in his beloved Switzerland. John Jacob died the next year in 1860, never to have seen his wife and children again. When Catherine Bayer, on the left, was still a child in Switzerland, she told the family at a 1932 reunion in Elgin that the lonely John Jacob took comfort in walking hand in hand with her through the fields. Upon arriving in America, the names Regula became Rachel, and the last name Hug was changed to Hug. When Rachel and her children and their families arrived in Utah, their lives were not easy. What an environmental shock it must have been to leave the high mountains of Switzerland with fresh spring water, rivers, and glaciers to a flat, dry desert. The family did not have an easy time eking out a living in a desert with brutal weather and little water. When Henry arrived in Utah from Switzerland in 1860, he was shocked at the conditions his family had endured in the 6 years before he arrived. William Roulette, the grandson and son of the mother and daughter named Rachel, retells the story of his birth at the 1943 Oregon Hug reunion. He was born in a dugout in 1865, 11 years after his parents and grandmother had arrived in Utah. As a child, he remembers the starving babies because their mothers didn't have sufficient food to produce enough milk. He recalls a family with the name Goobler who lived for 6 weeks on nothing but pigweed. His mother would gather the tender shoots of wood and willow sprouts to use as food. He remembers having so little to eat and crying for bread, and developing a large pot belly, even though his limbs were skin and bones. When a flood destroyed their dugout, they had lived in a wagon box for a time, and years later he realized that the death of his little sister Lydia was because of malnutrition. In the 1860s, there was a large influx of immigrants to Utah, with more than 35% foreign-born. Utah even gave women the right to vote in 1870. But many longtime church members, including the Huggs and many other families, were becoming disillusioned with church doctrine and Brigham Young's practice of plural marriage, and had left the faith before they migrated in the 1870s. It was at this time that former Mormons were moving to other places around the West, and the one place some of the Huggs went was Pumpkin Ridge in northeast Oregon, where there was fresh spring water, high mountains, and lots of timber. There were 2 federal acts that encouraged migration to the western states. One was signed by Abraham Lincoln on May 20, 1862, called the Homestead Act. The act granted 160 acres of free public land to settlers. The settler had to agree to live, cultivate, and build a dwelling over 5 years. With a small filing fee, the land was theirs. The second was written into law 42 years earlier, on April 24, 1820, and it was called the 1820 Federal Land Act. This act required full payment at the time of purchase. The minimum acreage was 80, and the price was $1.25 per acre, which came to $100 for 80 acres. Today, that price is equivalent to $28 per acre, or $2,240 for 80 acres. The first of John Jacob Hugg's children to leave Utah were the brothers, Jacob Hugg and David Hugg. They had lived 24 years in Utah. The year they left Utah, in 1878, Jacob was 51 years old and David was 43 years old. They headed for Pumpkin Ridge, Union County, Oregon. Using the Homestead Act, David obtained his 160 acres on the south-facing slope of Pumpkin Ridge. He had to wait 5 years, build a house, and start farming before he could get full title. Jacob purchased 80 acres through the 1820 Federal Land Act above David's place. He paid his $100 and owned a place with trees and spring water. Both brothers preferred the sloping hill rather than the valley floor. Maybe it reminded them of Switzerland. When looking at the maps, the property actually owned are the smallest rectangles or squares inside the bigger township and then sections. 10 years later, Jacob had a nice home overlooking the Grand Round Valley. The original house burned, but his descendant still lives on the original homestead today in a house that was rebuilt. 1 year later, in 1879, Henry Hugg Sr. followed. Henry was 50 years old when he left Utah. He, who had traveled all over Europe as a missionary, lost his first wife and child to mountain fever on his trek to Utah, remarried Anna Muller, and had 6 children while in Utah, made the wagon trip to Oregon, where he initially bought 40 acres below Jacob Hugg's place on Pumpkin Ridge and moved his family into a log cabin. He soon obtained his permanent home of 160 acres through the Homestead Act and settled on Cricket Flat. He bought another 160 acres and created a 320-acre farm. There was a third act to encourage replanting of trees, as logging was first before farming. If a homesteader planted 40 and then later 10 acres of trees, another 160 acres was given to them. Henry took advantage of the Timber Act and greatly increased his farm. Here is a picture of Henry Hugg's home east of Elgin. To the left in the farm picture, you can see a plantation of trees. Here is Henry's home. It stood until the 1970s when it was torn down. 3 brothers were now in Oregon. 1 year after Henry came, their brother John Hugg followed in 1880. John was 47 years old. His son Henry was 21. There are no land patents for John, but there are 2 for Henry Hugg. These land patents, according to Bernal Hugg's book, 100 Years of Huggs, were about 2 miles north of Jacob and David on Pumpkin Ridge. John or Henry obtained 80 acres of timber using the cash payment of the 1820 Act and another 160 acres using the Homestead Act. It is possible these 2 claims are where John and maybe the son Henry built. The last of the brothers and the youngest, Rudolph Hugg, came the next year in 1881. He was 45 years old. He obtained his 160 acres through the Homestead Act, which was between his 2 brothers, Jacob and David Hugg's places on Pumpkin Ridge. There is a record in the Hugg Reunion book that states he bought the Jack Bloodworth farm on Pumpkin Ridge, but the BLM records only show Rudolph owning it. Rudolph expanded his place by also buying another 80 acres through the 1820 Federal Act, making his farm a total acreage of 240 acres. 4 brothers and their families are all now on Pumpkin Ridge or east of Elgin, most within walking distance of each other. Rudolph's direct descendant still owns and farms the same property today. The descendant, Gary Post, likes to tell the story of visiting his grandpa Alma, son of Rudolph, and his grandma Fay in the original farmhouse in the 1950s. His mother, Mary Marguerite, grew up there and had a nice circus toy that she left in her parents' home. When Gary, who was about 7 years old, visited his grandparents, he was told he wasn't allowed to play with the circus toy, but it had a really nice little bear that Gary coveted. So on one visit, Gary, when no one was paying much attention to him, went to play with the circus toy and stuck that little bear in his pocket. A few weeks afterwards, the entire house caught fire. His grandpa, who was the only one home at the time, barely made it out of the house with only his clothes on. Everything burned, including a large stack of photo albums. The only thing that survived was the little bear that Gary had stuck in his pocket and secreted home on his last visit. The last of the 6 siblings to leave Utah and come to Oregon was the sister Rachel. She arrived 5 years after Rudolph in 1886. She waited until her second husband, Frederick Roulette, had died. She was 62 years old, but obtained her 160 acres through the Homestead Act next to Henry Hugg's place east of Elgin. All 6 children of the Swiss patriarch John Jacob had now migrated from Switzerland to Utah to Union County, Oregon. John Jacob's wife Rachel had passed away in 1861 in Utah 1 year after his death in Switzerland. So back to Bernal Hugg. Henry Hugg Sr. is Bernal Hugg's grandfather. Henry had 6 children. One of those was Bernal's father, Walter Fridolin, who went by Fridolin. Fridolin was 15 years old when he came to Oregon with his father and family in 1879. In 1904, when he was 40 years old, he made a cash purchase under the 1820 Act for 120 acres east of Pumpkin Ridge, next to his father, Henry Hugg's place. Fridolin's farm was on a hill with rocky soil. A house to live in is important for a farm, but without a good road to move equipment in and out so the harvest can get to town and good fences to keep the animals confined, a farm is going to have a hard time succeeding. Fridolin spent many years working on the road to his farm. As told by his grandson, Bernal Hugg Jr., Grandpa would use a pickaxe, shovel, and crowbar, moving smaller rocks under a big boulder. When enough small rocks worked as a fulcrum to move the boulder, Grandpa would hitch up the horse team and pull the boulder away from the roadbed. Fridolin spent his years in hard labor building his farm, but he had a creative mind. To relieve himself of some of that hard labor, he designed a better fence. Bernal Hugg Sr., Fridolin's son, recorded how Fridolin came up with his fencing idea. Until 1890, when barbed wire was invented, fencing was made with split rails. The rails had to be close enough to keep chickens in their pen and out of the garden. Barbed wire was a great invention that alleviated the need to split and haul large numbers of rails. The barbed wire was fastened to posts, but posts were hard to place into rocky ground, and after a few years in wet soil, they rotted and had to be replaced. Around 1900, farmers began building cribs instead of just one post every 6 feet or so. The cribs were filled with rocks, and the wire was fastened to the crib. Posts were used to keep the wire separated and didn't need to be in the ground. But the square stone crib they built had a few faults. It is big and took up a lot of room. It required a lot of rock to fill it, and over time it settles out of plumb. Fridolin didn't like the big clumsy pile of rock. He also reasoned that 4 corners weren't as strong as a structure built of triangles, so it wouldn't rock from side to side. He called this triangle structure a Stangen, which in German means pole or stick. The one in this picture had been in use for 40 years when the picture was taken, but this also had its faults. The cross pieces at the bottom were too close to the ground, and even though it can't be seen in the picture, they have rotted out. It is much better to put the cross pieces 8 or 10 inches above the ground and support them with at least 4 rocks to form a foundation. This triangle crib only has 1 nail at each joint. Better to have 2. Fridolin soon discontinued this design and developed a second alternative. He redesigned to build the corner against the wire, up off the ground, and the wood to build the crib was split from green trees to the proper length and size for each part. He discovered that green wood was stronger and lasted longer. This crib was 40 years at the time of the picture. He continued to improve on his design, adding a few more improvements. His final design had several key points. Keep the crib above the dirt with a rock foundation. The triangle-shaped post in the fence line saves much hewing and fitting of the posts. Use 2 spikes at all 8 joints equaling 16 nails. Keep the load of rock down so not to put undue strain on the structure. Use light stakes or posts between the crib to keep weight from pulling the wire at an angle. And finally, when possible, build with new wood, sawed and split to the proper size. His invention was soon used by fellow farmers. Fridolin was not the only inventive Hugg and influence upon Bernal. Bernal's uncle Eugene F. Hugg, brother to Fridolin, was an inventor, a photographer, an entrepreneur, a musician. He made his own violin and started the Elk Flat Band, and a self-taught mechanic. Today, he probably would have become an engineer. Eugene was born in Utah. When he was 2, he fell out of his high chair onto his back. He developed a lump at the injury, and the lump grew, causing his back to curve significantly. His disability limited his help on the farm, but it gave him the freedom to use his inventive mechanical mind. He loved tearing apart a machine, a watch, or a Model T, and putting them back together again. Eugene started a store, advertised it on a rock on the main road, took a picture of his horse and buggy, his shadow, and probably his wife and child in the buggy. Bernal, too, was known for his photography and accumulated several cameras and took several of his own pictures for his books. Eugene not only owned and ran a general merchandise store in Elgin. When Model Ts came to town, he bought a dealership in LeGrand, and when he lost that, he built a wooden toy factory. Henry Hugg Sr. loved the music of the church and instilled that love of music to his children. Eugene and his brothers, Julius and Fridolin, played at dances, and Eugene formed 2 bands. he started the Elk Flat Band, and when he moved to town, the Elgin Band. Eugene had many successes and failures in his long life, but according to family documents, he was always an optimistic person, even when faced with cruel comments about his disability. But back to Bernal. Bernal Hug, son of Fridolin and Beatrice Hug, graduated from Elgin High School and went on to Oregon State College. He married Carmi Elizabeth Holbrook in 1920, and they had 7 children together. He was always trying new things and ideas on his farm. He brought in the first combine, worked with the Oregon State Extension Service to plant experimental plots of new crops, and held many positions in growers' associations. Here is a picture of his farmhouse and him haying, but he also planted several acres of cherries and other fruit. However, his passion was writing. According to Leora Hug, currently of Alicel, Bernal, when taking his daily breaks from farming, would go to his journal and write. He wrote at least 16 books and edited the Union County Historical Society Journal for many years, completely writing at least 2 of the volumes. His first book was The History of Elgin, Oregon, which he published in 1958. It is the most complete volume of an example of how European influence took only 20 years to completely change an environment that hadn't seen anything that dramatic in thousands of years. The Elgin Recorder reissued the book in pieces over several columns in 1959. He was never a journalist or reporter, just a keeper of historical records, and a sensitive witness to something that can never be recaptured. He loved history. A year before the Oregon Centennial of 1959, he let his beard grow. The Hugs held a reunion for at least 40 years, from 1921 to 1961, for the descendants of the 6 children of John Jacob. Through marriages, the Hugs added at least 141 new family names to their descendants, many who still live in the local area. This concludes a brief history of the Hug family. I want to thank Charlie Horn, Gabrielle Hug, Leora Hug, Gary Post, Rebecca Kalal, and Daniel Kalal. Any mistakes are clearly my own. Please help yourselves to refreshments and the rest of the museum.